Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another event in the Perspectives on Economic Liberty series, hosted by the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty here at Arizona State. And this event is also co-sponsored by the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and also the Institute for Humane Studies. The Perspectives series emerges from our center's mission to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. One of the ways to fulfill that mission is to invite a variety of guests who will interrogate our center's topic by revisiting past debates over the role of economic liberty, evaluate economic liberty's contribution to human betterment for good or ill, and consider its relationship to other human values and freedoms that we may hold. Most of the events in the Perspective series so far, and probably in the future as well, will be lectures by individuals. But this afternoon we have the opportunity to listen to a dialogue between two of the best historians of economic thought in America, both of whom I am very happy to call dear friends. Both have served as presidents of the History of Economics Society, and they're going to be discussing two of the 20th century's most famous economists, John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich August Hayek. The notion that Keynes and Hayek were key figures in the eternal battle between capitalism and socialism was reinforced by the 2010 rap video, Fear of the Boom and Bust, and the subsequent 2011 rap video, Fight of the Century. Tonight's event will not be another rap video, but rather a conversation about the commonalities and differences and even friendship between the two men. Moderating and serving as a question launcher for the event is Arizona State's own Scott Scheall, who is I've altered my organization here, so I have to switch pages, who is assistant professor and director of graduate studies in the Faculty of Social Science at the College of Integrative Arts and Sciences. Scott has been a research fellow in the center that I'm going to mention in a minute that Bruce Caldwell runs, and is now the co-editor of the annual volumes Research in the History of Economic Thought and Methodology. He's also the co-host of the podcast Smith and Marx Walk into a Bar, a History of Economics podcast, and the audio recording of this evening's discussion will appear on that podcast. Let me introduce our two guests. Brad Bateman is the president of Randolph College in Virginia. He graduated from Alma College in economics and knew that he wanted to devote his life to studying the history of economic thought and teaching in a liberal arts college setting. After getting a graduate degree and teaching at Grinnell College, he served as provost at Denison University in Ohio, and then assumed the presidency of Randolph College several years ago at a time when liberal arts education was in the midst of crisis. I guess he'd say it still is. He has become a national voice for liberal arts education. His credentials for being here this evening, however, come from his long study of the work of John Maynard Keynes, including the book Keynes's Uncertain Revolution and my personal favorite, Capitalist Revolutionary, John Maynard Keynes, written with our joint friend Roger Backhouse. He and Roger also collaborated together as editors of the Cambridge Companion to Keynes. Bruce Caldwell, our other guest, is director of the Center for the History of Political Economy, commonly called the Center for Hope, at Duke University. The center's mission is to promote and support research in and the teaching of the history of economic thought. Bruce's first book, Beyond Positivism, Economic Methodology in the 20th Century, played a key role in launching new approaches to economic methodology and the study of the history of methodology in economics. As part of his research, Bruce became interested in what is often called Austrian economics and the work of F.A. Hayek. He is the author of Hayek's Challenge, an intellectual biography of F.A. Hayek, and is currently working on a full biography of Hayek authorized by the family. He also took over responsibility a number of years ago, 10 years ago maybe, roughly, for Hayek's collected works. Please join me in welcoming Brad and Bruce to ASU and to the entire panel for participating.
Hello, thank you for joining us. Very happy to be here. Let's begin with a bit about our two central characters, Hayek and Keynes. Professor Bateman, why don't you tell us who was John Maynard Keynes? What are the most important things to know about him and his career?
Thanks very much, Scott, and thank you, Ross, for that very nice introduction. John Maynard Keynes was a British economist, born in Britain in the 1880s, in 1883. He was born into an upper middle class family. His father was a professor at University of Cambridge and became the registrar, which would be the top administrative figure in the university. Keynes has a very unusual background to become a leading economist. He studied mathematics as an undergraduate and philosophy as a graduate student. Not so unusual today, but in his own time, somewhat unusual. He's arguably the greatest economist of the 20th century. And when I say that, I'm going to say this in a very particular way. He developed a model of the economy in his 1936 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which became the backbone of mid-century macroeconomics, and in particular, the backbone of the econometric revolution that took place after the Second World War. So he was a great economic modeler at a moment, just at the moment when models were emerging as the way that economists did theory. But it's very important for the discussion we'll have today to understand that in his philosophical background, he was particularly influenced by a Cambridge philosopher named G.E. Moore. And through that influence of Moore, Keynes, on the one hand, rejected utilitarianism, which is a backbone for most contemporary mainstream economics. And instead of believing that people were always animated to get the greatest pleasure they could or to avoid the most pain they could, he believed they were motivated by a great complex of motivations. In particular, for himself, and again, this came through Moore's influence, the greatest goods in the world were friendship and art, and the enjoyment of friendship and the enjoyment of art. This becomes very important to understand some things that happened later in his career. So he's perhaps best known, and this will be a topic of our discussion today, I think. He's best known as being someone who argued that there is a role for government in making capitalism function well. He was not a socialist. He disliked Marxism. He disliked state socialism. He disliked Bolshevism. He was deeply opposed to fascism. And so if you've heard that the debate between Hayek and Keynes is between capitalism and socialism, that's simply not the case. Keynes was not an anti-capitalist. He was not a socialist. And understanding his work depends on understanding that distinction and not falling into the easy rhetorical traps that we often fall into in American debate about economics, that if you don't like what's happening in capitalism today, you must be a socialist. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. I say a question to you, Professor Caldwell. Who was F.A. Hayek?
Okay, and I'd like to echo my thanks. This is my first time in Tempe, and I hope I pronounced it correctly. It wasn't the way I pronounced it when I first arrived, but I was quickly corrected, so delighted to be here. Well, Friedrich Hayek was an Austrian economist and social theorist. He was born in 1899 and died in 1992, so his lifespan spanned the 20th century. And he was one of these zealot sorts of characters that managed to be at the right place at the right time throughout his career. Excuse me, he started off in Vienna after World War I, went to the university there, and while he was at university, one of his classmates was Oscar Morgenstern, who invented game theory, a mathematical technique that's used extensively in the social sciences today. He came under the influence of Ludwig von Mises, one of the leading Austrian economists. He went to New York for about 15 months right after he graduated from university and met Wesley Clair Mitchell, who was the leading institutionalist economist of his day, the most prominent American economist. He sat in on his class. He gave the last paper in a seminar run by J.B. Clark, another famous American economist. He goes to England, immediately gets embroiled, this is in 1931, in a debate with John Maynard Keynes, that we'll talk a little bit about later. He's also at the London School of Economics. While Keynes is at Cambridge, he's at the London School of Economics with Lionel Robbins, Nicholas Caldwell, a raft of people who would later become very famous economists, and they were developing basically the formalism by which today's microeconomics is expressed. He leaves London after World War II. Before he left, he founded the Mont Pelerin Society, which became a very important classical liberal source of ideas. And he went to the University of Chicago. He arrives in Chicago just as the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman, Aaron Director, and George Stigler is forming. He's at Chicago until the mid-60s. In the 70s, he gets a Nobel Prize jointly with Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish socialist. By this time, Hayek is known as a free market advocate. I guess the committee was thinking, well, we'll balance it a little bit by putting these two up for the prize at the same year. Both of them knew each other from the 30s and pretty much detested each other, both personally and in terms of their ideas. So it wasn't, I interviewed Hayek's daughter about the Nobel ceremony, and she said, well, yes, Myrdal seemed to be a gloomy sort of fellow, and I didn't want to tell her exactly how far back the animosity between the two went. But anyway, this was a figure of great interest intellectually because of all the people he knew and his interactions with them. You said what sorts of ideas. Certainly the debate with Keynes is one part of his legacy, but I think also his profound critique of socialism that he did in papers in the 1930s on a theoretical level and in a more popular way with his book from 1944, The Road to Serfdom. And in addition, not just a critic of socialism, but a defender of a well-functioning market system. And one of his great insights is that if you have a well-functioning market system, I say well-functioning because there's certain things that need to be in place in order for it to function properly, that it's a marvelous mechanism for coordinating human action in a world in which knowledge is dispersed among many, many, many different people. I want to echo something that Professor Bateman said. They were actually great friends, although they had this big debate in the early 1930s when the London School of Economics evacuated London and moved to Cambridge during World War II. Keynes got Hayek rooms at King's, his college. Just before the war started, Keynes wrote an essay, How to Pay for the War, and Hayek was effusive in his praise. I think Brad put his finger on it. Both of them were trying to save capitalism. They disagreed. This is during the Great Depression. They disagreed about the methods, but they thought, well, we certainly, if we don't save capitalism, we will end up in something like socialism, or at least that danger is there. So on that particular point, they were very much in agreement.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the debate that their names are forever linked to. In part, thanks to this popular YouTube video that Ross mentioned, which featured actors portraying the pair engaged in a rap battle, which again, we're not going to try to recreate here. If you haven't seen the video, or the videos, I strongly recommend checking them out. They're very entertaining and also educational. They give you a fairly accurate depiction of what their theories were, what their perspectives were. So I encourage you to look at the videos. So perhaps you could each give us your take on the Hayek-Keynes debate as such, both the narrow debate, which is what took place between the two of them in the 1930s, and the broader debate that is, you might say, still ongoing between people that are followers of Keynes and people that are followers of Hayek or of the Austrian tradition. So first to you, Professor Caldwell, what's your take on the Hayek-Keynes debate?
Okay, well, it was, this is a wonderful story, because Hayek is much younger than Keynes, and is invited to the London School of Economics to give 4 lectures that end up being a short book called Prices in Production. And this is right at the beginning of the Great Depression. He's talking about continental monetary theory, and offers a theory of the cause of the business cycle, and talks a little bit about policy at the end. And on the basis of these lectures, he's invited to come to London School of Economics, first for a visiting year, and then he's offered a position there. And while he was there giving the lectures, his host said, look, John Maynard Keynes has just written this book, A Treatise on Money. You're the person who knows about monetary theory. Why don't you write a review for us? And Hayek agreed to do this. And I have the correspondence between Robbins and Hayek. This is a difficult book. And Hayek's book is a difficult book. And about 5 or 6 months later, Hayek is writing to Lionel Robbins and saying, this is a difficult book. I don't really know what to make of it. And if you read his review, you can see that he was having a hard time with it. But he's quite critical of Keynes. And the background was that both Hayek and Keynes made use of the work of a Swedish economist named Knut Wicksell. And Knut Wicksell, though Swedish, wrote in German. And he wrote 3 books in German that were all interrelated. Of course, Hayek reads German as his first language, whereas Maynard Keynes, who also makes use of Wicksell's work, has a hard time reading German. He even actually says this in A Treatise on Money, that I can only understand things in German that I already understood before I read it. So Hayek takes this opportunity to go on the attack. And Keynes is furious. Who is this upstart? He's 17 years younger. He's from some other country. He shows up and he's writing this scurrilous stuff. And Keynes's biographer said, you know, of all the pieces of Keynes's writings in his archives, this is the most marked up piece. He's furious with Hayek. And Keynes is one of the most superb writers and speakers you could ever meet. Hayek would talk about Keynes's bewitching voice, how he would have a crowd in the palm of his hands after talking. So what Keynes did was to write a response to Hayek, and he makes his points in his response, but he also takes it as an opportunity to say, well, okay, I made perhaps some mistakes in my work, but you should see the garbage that this guy has in prices in production. Although he wouldn't say it in that kind of vulgar way. What he actually said was, Hayek's book is an extraordinary example how starting with a mistake, a remorseless logician can end up in Bedlam, which is a lunatic asylum, if you don't know what Bedlam refers to. So this was the big battle. This appears in academic journals. This is British society. Obviously, a debate is taking place. And things simmered down, and Hayek went on to write A Pure Theory of Capital, which virtually no one has read. I read it, and it was a tough slog. Whereas Keynes writes the most famous book of the 20th century, The General Theory. So they both kind of went to their own camps and created something else that came out of it. Now, one of the things that you asked was what about their followers? And in some ways, their followers are much less interesting than the principals, and often are doing things that are quite different. But one thing that I would say is this: Hayek lived through the hyperinflation that afflicted Germany, but also Austria, where he lived after World War I. And he was afraid. He saw inflation as the greatest danger. This is oversimplifying things, but I think in a way that may be helpful. Whereas Keynes lived in the 1920s, well, he lived much longer, but after World War I, unemployment was, in his wonderful phrase, stuck in a rut for 10% throughout the decade of the 1920s. There were structural changes taking place in the British economy. There was a return to gold at an overvalued par, and they had a general strike, and they were worried about revolution. So this is the sense in which I'm saying both people were trying to save capitalism. Hayek saw what hyperinflation did in Germany and Austria, which is to bring about fascism, and Keynes was worried about the problems of unemployment and how that might ruin a society. So their models emphasize the problems of those two different possibilities. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Brad, what's your take on the debate?
So I want to thank Bruce for doing a really nice job of summarizing, and not, I won't repeat that. It's a very accurate depiction. I'm going to take it and twist it just a little bit. I'm going to add a precursor to the story, playing off what Bruce just finished saying, and turn the frame a little bit. So the first thing is, when Hayek first encountered Keynes, he encountered Keynes as a critic of the rampant inflation on the continent following the First World War. Of course, Keynes was a world figure because of his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he said the reparations being laid on the Germans, if they're not relieved, will lead to a demagogue. He's often credited with having predicted Hitler's rise. And Hayek appreciated the work that Keynes did, particularly in putting together his tract on monetary reform, which really was a story about the problems of inflation in the early 20s on the continent. So Hayek started out from a position of liking Keynes.
Absolutely.
What I would say, the way I would slightly twist Bruce's story is I would say Hayek and Keynes were both believed in the late 20s, early 30s as the decade turned, that they would produce the great book of monetary theory, and they both failed. Keynes' treatise on money is a failure. I've said this in print several times. It was not a successful book. And Prices and
Which
Production.
he acknowledges in the introduction,
Yeah,
right?
right. And Hayek's book, Prices and Production, was not a success either. And they got really angry at each other for saying that publicly about each other. So the original Hayek-Keynes debate is two men who failed, two men with large egos who failed and were mad at each other for telling the truth about each other.
I think that's a very good way of putting it. So sort of staying in this vein, the Nobel Prize-winning economist John Hicks, I should say Sir John Hicks, who knew both men very well. He was a student at the LSE while Hayek was there and later taught at Cambridge. John Hicks once posed the question, which was right in the debate, Keynes or Hayek? So I'm not going to ask either of you to take a position. I take that to be assumed. But I would like to ask, because I think this is part of an important question to ask about the debate. How would we tell which was right? What would the evidence look like if Keynes were definitively right or if Hayek were definitively right? Brad, would you care to take this question first?
Well, thanks, Scott. I think to try to answer the question you're trying to ask, you've got to look past what Bruce and I have talked about in this original debate. Neither one of them were right. They both wrote bad books. What I can say, and I think Bruce acknowledged this, Keynes, you might ask the question about the follow-up books. And in that sense, Keynes won. Keynes did write a book which became accepted as a guide to macroeconomics in mid-century, and Hayek didn't. But I don't think that's really what the debate what the debate would probably be, who's right, that the capitalist economy works best if it has a minimal amount of government intervention with the right legal structure, a constitution of liberty, or does it work better if there's government involvement in the economy to help it work better? As you said, I believe that government does need to be involved in the economy in order to make capitalism successful and to particularly to make it legitimate. Like Keynes, I worry deeply about unemployment and about the legitimacy of capitalism. I worry a lot about income inequality. I worry about the unintended consequences of capitalism. And so I think that Keynes is right. I think that there does need to be government involvement in a capitalist economy. You want to know how would I know, right?
That's the difficult part.
So let me put it this way. Suppose you had an economy that fell into a deep recession quickly. It had been chugging along, doing well. You had a global financial crisis. The economy collapsed. Unemployment rose above 10%. So here's what roughly you might predict from the Keynes and Hayek position. Hayek would say, leave it alone, don't touch it, it'll turn out okay. Some people are going to be hurt, but there'll be adjustments in prices and things will work out. And the Keynesian would say, and particularly if you read the general theory, you'd say, push interest rates very low and keep them there, and the economy will recover. Get some public works projects going if you can, particularly if you've got shovel-ready projects, bring them out and get them going. So this happened. This story actually happened. This happened in 2008-9. We had a global financial crisis. The economy plummeted. Unemployment went above 10%. Interest rates got pushed down very, very low and were kept there. They've never been that low in modern history. Hayek would have predicted wild inflation, destruction of the capitalist economy, and in fact, it worked. So I'd say Keynes is right.
Bruce, so what sort of grounds your preference for Hayek and why? I mean,
Sure.
Why do you think he's right?
So the way that you worded the question, I'm actually going to challenge because I think Hayek's later work suggests that kind of question is not one that's going to be able to be answered.
Well, you know I fully agree with that.
So Hayek views the economy by the time he's working in the 70s. And if you look at his Nobel Prize address in 1974, it's actually a methodological piece. That is to say, he says, well, we're in the middle of stagflation right now. We economists have made a mess of things. Now, as Brad said, his ideas were not in favor. So when he said we economists, he meant you economists who are following Keynes. So I mean, he was being polite, but also people knew what he was saying when he was saying it. He thought that when you have a complex phenomena like an economy that is so large, that if you intervene, sometimes you're going to get the results that you think you should. You're in a recession, increase aggregate demand. maybe that will pull you out of the recession. Okay? The example was given by Brad where that took place. But he said sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. What his model that he originally developed in the early 30s said was that if you keep interest rates too low for too long, that's what sets up malinvestment. That was the phrase that would be used by the Austrians. So, and when is it going to happen? I don't know. When is the turn going to happen? I don't know. We can't tell. But this is a dangerous thing. What you want to do is to try to keep, in his view, money neutral. And the problem with keeping money neutral is we know what the market rate of interest is, but we don't know what the natural rate of interest is. They both are supposed to be equal, but if we don't know what one of these variables are, how do you know? The Fed these days is actually talking about a neutral interest rate. If you listen to reports from the financial newspapers, say, so what is this neutral interest rate? Well, it's the one that if you happen to hit it, nothing bad happens. And if something bad happens, then we got to change it. But that's about as far as we've gotten in 100 years of macroeconomics. Hayek had lots of different approaches to what is called macroeconomics, started out defending the gold standard, went away from that. By the 1970s, he was talking about denationalization of money, having competing currencies. So just to take the wonderful example that Brad did, and when I'm saying I think Hayek's right, I think he's right that we just don't know a lot about the economy. That's what I think he's right about. A lot of people said the whole reason that we had the Great Recession after this moderation of many, many years, the great moderation of the 90s and the early 2000s, is that every time that things started to look like they were getting recessionary, Greenspan would cut interest rates. In fact, I have friends in the financial industry who said they called it the Greenspan push. Okay? Whenever things got bad, they could rely on him to do the push. So people after a while started to get expecting that, kept interest rates low for a long time. Hayek says that's going to set up, you're going to have asset bubbles and financial bubbles. And one of the examples that Hayek would point to is the massive set of think of Las Vegas, where you have apartments that are stopped right at in the middle of their construction. He said, well, what's going to happen when a recession comes is people are going to realize they misallocated capital and they're going to stop, and that's what causes the recession. So that would be, I think, the Hayekian response.
There's a very interesting sense in which the two theories are complementary, in that Hayek gives you this story about how you get a bust, and Keynes tells you a story about what to do when you're in a bust. So they're not quite in as much tension as it might seem. I'd also like to mention, just because Bruce did, that for further reading, I recommended the video. Bruce is quite right that Keynes's 1936 General Theory is the most important book in the 20th century in the social sciences, but Hayek's Nobel Prize lecture in 1974 called The Pretense of Knowledge, I would argue, is the most important essay of the 20th century in the social sciences. So check it out. It's wonderful. Anyways, moving on. So we've talked about the debate. Let's talk about a little bit about the relationship between the two and the relationship between you two. In today's era of polarized politics, it is important to ask, what value, if any, do you find in your opponent's position? What lessons can a Hayekian learn from a Keynesian perspective, and vice versa? What can a Keynesian learn from a Hayekian? Who did I go to? You go ahead, Bruce.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that you actually did make a very good point that for the purposes of this debate, we are trying to represent the strong versions of each. But Hayek himself, in the mid-1970s, he had a friend from Vienna named Gottfried Haberler, who was a monetary expert and who said, look, you know, you're saying don't do anything during a downturn. What about that stuff that we used to talk about back in the 30s, the secondary depression? That is to say, you would say, well, when you have an initial downturn, just let it work its way out. But if you start to get a deflation taking place, so think about what happens during a deflation. A deflation means that prices in general are starting to fall. And think about what rational behavior is. If you think the prices of things are going to be lowered tomorrow, what are you going to do today? You're going to wait till tomorrow, until the prices are lower. Well, if everybody's waiting until tomorrow to buy stuff, prices are going to keep falling. And then there's going to be even more incentive to wait till tomorrow. If you want to really reduce aggregate demand and get into a deep recession, if you start to get deflation going, you can get a secondary recession that is not caused by the first one. Haberler talked to Hayek about that, and Hayek said, and he didn't say it publicly, but he did say it in letters. You're right. Yeah, I could see that. And I think that is a point where Hayek would concede to Keynes. I would also say, as Brad did, Keynes was a hero to Hayek when he was a young man due to his very passionate attack on the really severe conditions, the Carthaginian peace is what he called it, of the Versailles Peace Treaty, that he thought was really setting up Central Europe for the sort of horrible outcome that ended up happening with people like Hitler and Mussolini taking over. And finally, I would say, boy, I wish Hayek could write like Keynes. He'd have a lot more influence if he could write like Keynes.
I'm very happy that he couldn't.
Keynes is a beautiful prose artist, just a beautiful prose artist. Yep.
That I completely agree. That just reading Keynes is just a wonderful experience, even if you don't agree with him. It's just these incredible bon mots he just tosses out like it's nothing. But anyways, over to you, Brad. What can a Keynesian learn from a Hayekian?
I'll play off this last comment first. There are a series of essays and talks in the early 20s that Keynes gave in which he reveals that his greatest disappointment in life is that he wasn't born with a gift to be an artist. And I think he, as some of you will know, he was intimately involved with the Bloomsbury Group. Art was central, as I said earlier, art was central to his value system. And I think he was a great writer because he wanted to be a creative force. He believed in this, and he worked hard on his prose to do this. So I would say there is a philosophical similarity between Keynes and Hayek that we could talk about, which has to do with this question of not knowing the future, not understanding the present fully. But instead of talking about that, I want to go into a harder political reality. The kind of tools that Keynes' model allowed us to develop, tools to either push aggregate demand up when you wanted more employment, or to push aggregate demand down when you wanted to fight inflation, as in how to pay for the war. These are powerful tools, but they don't always work right.
Right.
They're sometimes used incorrectly, and sometimes the conditions have changed underneath you. By the time you get a policy package pushed through and put in place and it starts to act, it's not the right time for what you have put into the mix. And you can oversell this power. You can mistakenly use these tools, and you can oversell their power. And this is, I think this is unfortunate politically, and you see the cost of this in Western Europe over the last 50 years. Again and again, when better market conditions would help the economy, Western Europeans have tended to reach for these demand management tools when they're not the right tool to use. And they've been reluctant to admit that they sometimes don't work. So you end up getting the wrong tool used at the wrong time, and then it becomes ineffective. And there's no good in that. And so I think that economic policymakers should know from Hayek to be able to tell the truth when the policy hasn't worked well, and to be able to tell the truth when you don't know that this is the right policy tool to use at this moment? Those are tough questions, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in this that good policymakers have to have, and I wouldn't want to deny that.
Self-reflection is not exactly a strong suit of many politicians, I don't think. But
anyone in mind?
But we can leave that subject. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about what really brings us here today, and that's the topic of economic liberty. We are brought here by ASU's Center for the Study of Economic Liberty. So let's talk about Hayek's and Keynes' respective views on economic freedom. Perhaps we should start, however, with a discussion of economic liberty itself. What is economic liberty, and how is it different from other forms of liberty? For example, political liberty. I'm thinking specifically of Hayek's argument in his famous book, The Road to Serfdom, that in order to be politically free, you have to have economic freedom. Economic freedom is a prerequisite for political freedom. You cannot be politically free without economic freedom, according to Hayek. So Bruce, perhaps you can elaborate on Hayek's argument, and Brad, perhaps you can follow up with a Keynesian take on Hayek's argument.
Yeah, so Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom. It was published in 1944. And in Britain at the time, all through the 30s, there were people who were advocating socialism. Socialism is a plank in the Labor Party platform. Socialism being defined as public ownership of the means of production, state ownership of the means of production, no private firms. And socialists who were arguing for this at the time said, look, what we're proposing is that the government take over the economic stuff, the economic side. It's not going to affect your political liberties. Nobody likes to be concerned with the money-grubbing aspects of economics. Anyway, we'll take care of that, and it won't have any effect in terms of your political liberties. So Hayek said, well, let's look carefully at what happens under a centrally planned regime. Basically, the planners are saying, we're going to make the decisions about how much to produce of each type of good. And in a world of scarcity, if you're producing more agricultural goods, you might be producing less education. You might be employing more plumbers, but you might be employing fewer carpenters. These decisions are being made by central planners with some sort of vision about how to produce output for the economy as a whole. Well, of course, if they're not producing the goods that you want to buy as a consumer, that's going to have an effect on your well-being. If they want to suddenly get rid of some teachers because they need more plumbers and you're a teacher, that's certainly going to have an effect on your well-being and your state of mind. So what Hayek painted in The Road to Serfdom was said, let's just follow this logic out further. In that kind of environment, people who are good people are going to recognize that if they're the planners making these decisions, it's really having a profound effect on lots and lots of people who are unhappy. At the same time, there's going to be people who think, well, if I'm going to take care of myself, I want to get input into this political process. How am I going to be able to accomplish that? And indeed, he painted a scenario where the people who are going to be most able to take over the political process are going to be the ones who have the least scruples, who don't care if their decisions, in fact, are affecting others, because they recognize that having that kind of political power is going to be able to enable them to be able to make decisions for the rest of the economy. So he rejected the idea that if you give up economic decisions to a central power, that you could retain your other liberties. And that was, I think, his message in The Road to Serfdom. It must be emphasized, he was responding to a very specific set of proposals that were being made by public intellectuals in Britain during World War II. They're fighting this very horrible war against a horrible enemy, and a lot of the socialists were saying, when the war is over, what we need is a new socialist state. We can keep the central planning that is in place from World War II and continue it on in the future. And he was saying, well, don't believe the promises of the socialists that say just taking over the economics is going to not have an effect on the rest of your life. So that was his argument in Roads to Serfdom.
Brad, what do you think about this notion that economic freedom is a prerequisite for political freedom?
Well, I'm tempted here to quote Martin Luther King Jr. and to say there is no liberty if you don't have a job. Unemployed people are not free. They're easily manipulated, and so it turns the question in a completely different way and exposes a completely different set of concerns. And I very purposely want to lay that on the table to think about, because I think it's a perspective that we often miss. But it's not Keynes. Keynes did not say that, but I believe it reflects his philosophy very well. I would say, really, the particular argument that Hayek makes in The Road to Serfdom is part of it Keynes agrees with very clearly. He wrote 3 essays in the 1920s, The End of Laissez-Faire, Am I a Liberal, and Liberalism and Labor. And in those 3 essays, he makes it very clear that he's not interested in state ownership of the means of production, does not see this as a great future, but he doesn't go into this particular argument that Hayek makes, although he says clearly, I'm concerned about individual liberty. He says that himself already in the 20s. I think Keynes raises a more difficult question, which I want to finish by laying on the table, because I think it complicates in certain ways the position of many contemporary Austrians. Keynes says, look, I'm a member of the Liberal Party. I believe in liberalism, but I think liberalism has to change. And I think it has to change. He uses a framework that the American economist John R. Commons developed. And he says, in the 19th century, we had individualistic economy, and it produced great abundance. But today, the scale of production and the complications of contemporary capitalism have developed to the point that we're in what Commons refers to as the age of stabilization. There are other larger questions, such as what rights do workers have? And Keynes says this can go, so he thinks we've gone past the age of sort of raw free market capitalism, and we're in an age where the size of the enterprise makes it necessary that we rethink some of the basic questions about what we call economic freedom or economic liberty. And he says, I'm very worried about this. On the one hand, he says explicitly, fascism and Bolshevism are what are going to happen if this goes wrong. And so he's arguing in these essays for continuing the Liberal Party, even though Labor and the Conservatives are now taking over the political landscape, because he says somebody's got to continue to think about the questions of what it means to be free and how to guarantee individual liberty while also guaranteeing social justice. He says this is the complicated question.
I think this is an excellent point that you make, Brad, and I've made it myself, which is basically that.
Hence, you think it's excellent.
Naturally, but I think that modern Austrians are a bit oversimplistic in their conceptions of freedom and what it means to achieve a free society, and I think that's particularly problematic for Austrians who are supposed to be committed to the complexity of society. To offer an overly simple story about how we become liberal doesn't quite work to my mind. But anyways, let's continue talking a little bit about about Keynes on economic freedom. So related to this discussion, in 1930, just as the Depression was, well, becoming with each passing day more depressing, Keynes wrote an essay that must have been surprising at the time for the optimism it expressed about the future. In an essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, Keynes asked, what can we reasonably expect the level of our economic life to be 100 years hence? He answered this question to the effect that, quote, in the long run, mankind is solving its economic problem. I would predict that the standard of life in progressive countries 100 years hence will be between 4 and 8 times as high as it is today, unquote. So, Brad, perhaps you can elaborate, as Bruce did on Hayek's argument, perhaps you can elaborate on how Keynes reached this conclusion and what he took to be its economic or its implications for our lives, our well-being, our freedoms. Why was he so optimistic or sanguine about the economic possibilities 100 years hence? And what did he think their realization signified about the future of human freedom?
It's a great question. We don't have any extant archival material in which he works out these calculations. This was originally a talk that he gave to high school boys at Winchester. And so, but he did publish it in the Nation, and so he brought it to a larger adult audience. I think I look back to the economic consequences of the piece, where Keynes takes a very big picture view of the evolution of capitalism and sees that over time, despite the ups and downs, the trajectory is like this. And I think he just extrapolates and says, we're going to continue to see amazing wealth. But the real point of the essay isn't the economic projection. It's what he hopes people would be able to see in a different, wealthier future. He wants us to spend more time on art, more time on friendship, and less time in the economic struggle. He says if we're going to be that much more successful over the next 100 years, we should see the amazing abundance that will give us and understand that we really could pursue the highest things in the world, which for him, what you can call us elitist, but our friendship and art, and not just pursuing your own pleasure. I mean, actually, he's extremely accurate. We are now about 8 times as affluent as we were when he wrote the essay. So he was almost exactly spot on. It was an amazingly accurate prediction. But the part he wanted us to get from this, I would say we did not get. He was right in the material projection, but we haven't listened to him.
We found ways to fill our lives with yet more of the economic struggle somehow. So turning to you, Bruce, I mean, I'll ask you to follow up on this. Here we are almost 90 years since Keynes penned those words. How would you say, I mean, Brad just indicated that he thought the prediction is doing pretty well. How do you think it's looking? First with regard to economic growth, but also with regard to what Brad was saying, the effects of this growth on freedom. We're 9 decades on. What might Hayek say about Keynes's prediction, both the wisdom of making a prediction like that and its accuracy?
Well, it is amazingly accurate, just as Brad has said. I think Hayek, and we have to point out, this is not someone, Keynes, getting up and saying, this is a forecast I'm going to bet my life on. It was an aspirational piece, just as you've said. An aspirational piece that said, we can be in the future in a position where where the things that matter in life, according to Keynes's lights, but I think according to many of his readers' lights, can be accomplished without having to worry about making a living. Now, in terms of the prediction, I mean, you can't predict the course of future knowledge, so it's silly to talk about what things are going to be in 100 years. Keynes would have been dead wrong if we hadn't had World War II. If we hadn't had World War II and the Great Depression, I mean, we would have 20 times the income that we had in 1930. Well, I mean, you can't predict these things. I think
Don't predict that, Bruce.
I think it was pretty lucky that he hit it just like that. But again, as I would say, it was an aspirational piece that I think is a lovely piece of work. I have a colleague at Duke who teaches a course on Maynard Keynes, and he uses it as a way to look at the way the society was, the sorts of debates that were taken. It's really more than just a course on Keynes, but for the undergraduates, their final assignment is to interact with this essay. It is that lovely an essay. So another one of the things to be able to recommend that people have a look at.
We want to save some time for Q&A here, so if you don't mind, Brad, I'm going to move on to the last question here. So, as you noted, when The Road to Serfdom was published in 1944, Keynes actually wrote a postcard to Hayek. I know that Bruce and I have both held the postcard in our hand it's at the Stanford Archives, the Hoover Institution. And in this postcard, Keynes praises Hayek in the book and indicates his, quote, deeply moved agreement with Hayek's worry that centrally planned socialism, consistently pursued, inevitably leads to the erosion of freedoms that socialists themselves value. Keynes went on to say, however, challenging Hayek, that what we want is not no planning or even less planning. Indeed, I should say that we almost certainly want more. But the planning should take place in a community in which as many people as possible, both leaders and followers, wholly share your moral position. Moderate planning will be safe if those carrying it out are rightly orientated in their own minds and hearts to the moral issue, unquote. So I'd like to ask this question. In the era of Donald Trump, it seems especially important to ask, what is the significance of the fact that the American political system does not effectively ensure that those who set and implement policy are perhaps not rightly orientated in their minds and hearts to relevant moral issues? Brad, how might Keynes have reacted to Trump and more generally to modern Anglo-American populist movements?
Boy, I would have to be the one to answer first.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Keynes was a very cosmopolitan person. He was bisexual. His greatest friends were artists and free thinkers. He hated demagogues. He hated fascism. He believed in free trade, beginning to end. I think it would be a tough time for him.
The conception he had of policymakers and their responsibilities and their moral character, I think, is very different from our current situation. Bruce, what about Hayek? He had a theory as to why the, quote, worst get on top in certain political contexts. What does this theory imply about Trump and related phenomena?
Well, in The Road to Serfdom, there were a couple of chapters that I think might be relevant. One is why the worst get on top, and another is called The End of Truth. And indeed, what he laid out was a series of steps that a demagogue could use to gain power. Now, he had grown up in Vienna in the turn of the century. In Vienna, there was the mayor of Vienna. Once the franchise was extended, once the vote was extended to the workers, started a party that had as a basic platform anti-Semitism. I mean, it was a conscious part of the political party, and so he saw that. He saw the rise of Hitler, and so when he's writing The Road to Serfdom, he's got certain past memories in his head, and he said, well, three things that would be done for the worst to get on top is first you try to find a very simple and popular creed that can be appealing to a mass group. And then you also want to suck in those who go along with their friends and who are gullible. And he says, and finally, to really cement it, you need to have an enemy. The enemy can be internal or external. He talked about internal enemies like the Jews or the kulaks in Russia. External enemies are also possible in terms of just saying, well, you've got this, we are of the right blood, and these people are not like us, so we want to keep them out. Let's build a wall. So I think, in terms of the description that he had there, when looking not just at Trump, but at other populist movements, I mean, one of the groups that you can attack are plutocrats, and plutocrats have been much in the zone of fire, certainly among certain of the candidates, and I imagine this will be quite popular in 2020 as well. Now, the end of truth, I mean, it was almost comical when, in my mind, having read Hayek, when Rudy Giuliani said, truth isn't truth. I said, my goodness, what are you trying to illustrate? We want to have an illustrated road to serfdom or something? I mean, it was just too much. So I do think we do, to be more serious. We live in fraught political times, I think. Anyone who, no matter what your perhaps political persuasion is, can agree with that. And many of the dangers are indeed these kind of movements that have more shouting than talking. So this is one of the reasons it's a pleasure to share a stage with Brad. So.
Well, I'm going to exit the stage and let Ross take over and open up the field to questions from the audience. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. I feel like it's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you, Bruce and Brad.
Thank you.
We're going to take questions from the floor. The procedure we're going to use is myself and Mason have microphones, and we will bring them to you. We're going to give preference at the beginning to student questions because this is a university to serve students. And so we'll take the first a couple questions for sure from students, and students should make sure they indicate that they want to ask a question to us as we turn to others in the audience after the first couple. So are there students who want to ask questions? Hello.
Are there any presidential candidates in the current race who, in your view, have a particularly Keynesian or Hayekian perspective when it comes to the economy?
No one comes to mind on my side.
Yeah. I don't see too many either. Got to tell you, it's a little early though. I mean, people need to articulate their platforms. But certainly, Hayek was for free trade in ideas, in people, movement across borders, of goods, of capital. And that doesn't seem to be...
Not a big idea right now in the political arena.
Not a big idea,
country.
Right. And so you need to find a free trader, pretty wide open free trader who was for border security, but not making it quite as intense as things have become.
This is a question for Professor Bateman. I see kind of people crudely conflate Keynesian ideas with modern monetary theory. Could you maybe elaborate what he would have thought of it? What are the differences between the two? Thank you.
Yeah, modern monetary theory getting a lot of play, starting to get a lot of play. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez talks about it. This is it's not a set of ideas that Keynes ever talked about himself. I don't see it as a fundamentally Keynesian idea.
I was interested in the respective thinkers' stance on the relation between war and the economy, and how, if at all, war benefits economies alongside as well conquest.
Yeah. I'll try that in two different ways. So first I'll say that for better or worse, one of the reasons that Keynes' ideas were widely lauded in the 30 years after the Second World War is that people looked at the experience of the industrial democracies in the war, in producing armaments, and said, there you have it. Injection of government spending, recovery of the economy. It really was not until the rearmament and the war expenditure that the Western economies fully came out of the Great Depression. So often war has been taken as the Second World War as a proof, an argument for Keynes' ideas, and certainly in contemporary thinking in the 40s and 50s and 60s, I think it was understood that way. Keynes had a very complex relationship to war, and longer than you want to hear me talk about it. He didn't like war. He didn't. He worked very hard for Britain to help them win World War I. He worked very hard for Britain to help them win World War II. But he also filed for conscientious objector status in the First World War because on principle he said he didn't believe in war. But given that his nation was at war, he felt a moral responsibility to help them win. So when I say he helped them win, he worked in the background to make the financial means available for the British government to be able to continue to pay for the war, both the First and the Second World War.
I'll just say very quickly, Hayek fought for the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I, moved to England in the early 30s, and looking at what was happening on the continent with fascism, Austro-fascism in Austria, the Anschluss, where Germany annexed Austria by 38. He became a British citizen in 1938, even though his family was in Germany and Austria. So, and volunteered to fight. He didn't volunteer to fight. He was going to join the paratroopers, and his friend said, "You're over 40 years old, and you've got a German accent. No British soldiers going to listen to you." So he said, "You make a good point," and so he tried to do other things, and basically just ended up teaching students while the rest of his friends went into war work. But I mean, I think both of these men recognize that at certain times when freedoms are at risk, Western civilization itself is at risk, that it's necessary to go to war. But I think the massive waste, I mean, you produce armaments, and the day that the war is over, what are those things good for? You know, what are you going to use them for? These are things that were produced that, had you not been in war, you could have been producing other things that would actually make the society richer.
I wanted to ask I wanted to ask just a general question about Keynes's rhetoric specifically, but maybe you could also answer it in contrast to Hayek's, especially in economic consequences for our grandchildren. He seems to be highly aspirational and highly sort of futurist. Do you think that that's problematic insofar as it sort of aligns him with sort of more radical, first principle oriented philosophies like Marxism, or do you think that this is just sort of an aside from his normal economic theory?
It's a great question. I would say I'm going to use something written by a man named Don Mogridge. Don is a friend of ours. He's the editor of Keynes' 30-volume collected works, knows Keynes' works better than anyone in the world, and is also, I believe, Keynes' best biographer. And Don wrote a piece on the 50th anniversary of the general theory in which he talked about Keynes' rhetoric of revolution. Keynes really liked to talk about his revolution in economics, social revolution, ethical revolution, artistic revolution, well, all the while admitting that in certain ways his work was quite conservative. And I think he used this rhetoric because politically at the moment in Britain, he gave up on the Conservative Party, was watching the Labour Party take over the other side of the spectrum, and I think he was looking for a rhetoric that would help attract dynamically thinking people to liberal ideas, to help them understand that there was important work to be done in the Liberal Party, that you didn't have to be, as he referred to, the far left of the Labour Party. You didn't have to embrace the party of catastrophe. There was good and important work to be done elsewhere. So I think you have to look at it contextually.
I said I have two questions or two. Oh, one of them is we're talking about income inequality. Can it be compared to the inequality at the time of the robber barons? Would the causes be the same? And maybe you could say a few words about the possible remedies. And my other question is the emergence of strongmen in Europe, in Hungary, in Poland, the emergence of anti-Semitism, the treatment of Soros. Is that reminiscent of the, similar time in the Second World War, or again, causes? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think that there are certain really obvious things that can be done to fight inequality that people on the left and the right ought to agree about. For instance, education. It is the case in this country that the education you receive in kindergarten through the 12th grade is determined largely by your parents' income. And the lower your parents' income, on average, the lower the quality of schools available to you. And so the lower the opportunity available to you, and the lower the probability that you'll be able to build a life for yourself that would allow you to earn more and do well and define your own future for yourself. I believe we all ought to agree on that, and that there ought to be a lot more money put towards providing equal education for everyone. So this is a very simple thing. Instead of denigrating education, trying to tear down the education system, delegitimating the education system, underfunding the education system, we could do wonderful things to help make society more equal, simply to give people more equal opportunities if we gave people equal access to education. So this is one. For my own part, I deeply believe in figuring out a way to provide health care for everyone. Health care is devastating to families. I'm one of 3 boys. I have brothers who are 7 and 11 years older than I am. When I was 1, my brother, who's 7 years older than I am, developed a brain tumor and died. My father lost his job because of the disorder in his life, and my family had to go on public welfare. I don't think this is a problem. I think we need to be able to help people. Bad health, the things that happened to my brother. I have a son who had cancer for 3.5 years. I watched, he got great care because I had great health care. I watched other children who didn't get the same care. I don't think this is right. I think that a society with our means ought to be able to take care of its children. I think it ought to educate them, it ought to feed them, it ought to provide them with health care. I think these are fundamental things that we should be able to agree about. There may be better techniques and worse techniques. There may be techniques that won't work, techniques that will work, but we ought to be able to have a discussion about, I believe, about this. And certainly, if not everybody cares about inequality, so not everybody cares about these things, but there's certainly things we could do.
May I,
Yeah.
I'll just add a few words. I want to point out that Hayek in The Road to Serfdom and in all of his later writings, much to the horror of anarcho-capitalists, always argued for a safety net. Now,
Yeah.
I think he would have disagreed with Brad as to details, I'm sure, just as he did with Keynes, but he was not oblivious to that. Now, if you want to read a book that I think gives a very Hayekian take on this, it's a co-authored book about what we might do to try to address some of the problems that you talked about. It's a book called The Captured Economy. It's written by a self-proclaimed American liberal, so a man of the left, is one of the authors. The other author is a guy named Brink Lindsay, who was with the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, and it's looking at policies that both left and right can agree on, is seeking them out to try to correct for problems. And many of them are aiming at getting rid of crony capitalism. That is to say, where somebody who has a powerful position uses the government to make their position even more powerful. Licensing to keep out competition in industries of various sorts, from people who braid hair right up to physicians and lawyers who are quite good at being able to protect their markets. If you keep restrictions on entry into a profession, it enables you to make higher incomes. It favors the incumbents. And they go through a list of different sorts of ways that policies could be argued for. Now, all of these policies have vested interests in favor of them. So it's not like they're saying this is going to be easy. But the point of the book is to try to educate people as to certain ways to reduce, and all of these would, in fact, not only reduce inequality, but promote growth, because it would allow people to enjoy the dynamism that can exist in a capitalist economy. The Captured Economy by Tellis and Lindsay. Tellis is T-E-L-E-S.
Hi, so I'm a part of the Student Economics Association here at ASU, and we had a debate last night about the US-China trade war, and one of our main topics of conversation was the interconnectedness of different national economies, and I understand that one of the key points in the debate between Keynes and Hayek is government's ability to predict economic effects. So my question is, does the interconnectedness of the international economy currently increase or decrease our ability to predict the effects of regulating our own economies?
I think it makes it harder to predict. But I think it was always hard to predict. It's just that much harder. But that would be how I'd answer.
Yeah, I would agree. I would not say it makes it easier to predict. I would say that it increases the complexity. I think it increases the probability of greater material wealth, but I don't think you can predict when it's going to go up and when it's going to go down very easily.
You had said the unemployed aren't free, but I thought I remember reading something from Hayek about advocacy for a universal basic income, and also that the British healthcare system was based off of some of his work. I wonder if maybe you could talk about Hayek's. I don't really see the two as like at odds as maybe his.
Right.
influences like von Mises. But maybe you could talk about Hayek's views of the role of government. I don't think he was averse to taxes. I think he was pro-insurance policies.
So, when Hayek talked about the government, although many of his followers, I think, would say small government good, big government bad, Hayek actually said, now, he was not for the British national healthcare system. His son was a doctor in that, and he wasn't, okay? So when he said a safety net, he just wanted to, he basically said a society like Britain or the United States is sufficiently wealthy that there should never be a situation where people are starving. We shouldn't have that. So it was basically just, I think, basic human decency. He didn't say, and here's the philosophical principle on which I'm relying for that particular point of view. So you're right in the sense that he didn't say, well, big government is necessarily bad. What he was worried about was unconstrained government. So when he talked about the setup that he thought was most appropriate, and you'll find this in the Constitution of Liberty, he said it was a market system in a democratic polity under the rule of law, which means that every person is judged in the same way. It doesn't matter how important or unimportant you are, with strong constitutional protections of the sort that we have in our Bill of Rights. And many of the political institutions have built-in safeguards of the type that the founders were building in, where you have three parts of government: an independent judiciary, in terms of legislature, that you have a bicameral legislature, that you have various sorts of constraints on the government to keep, and the parts of the government are constraining each other. I think what he would be most worried about recently is kind of the exercise of executive power with the legislature doing nothing, just basically going along with it. I think that, to Hayek, would be one of the most horrifying parts of what's going on in the political scene in the United States today. But yes, he would say, but the size of government's going to be different. Different countries, in Western Europe, you're going to have certain preferences. In the United States, you might have very different ones. But what's more important is the sorts of constraints that we put on it and that we keep them in place.
Question about TARP. Would you comment on what Keynes or Hayek would have advised when that was being considered?
When
TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the 700 billion.
Right.
What would they have advised?
Yeah. So I'll take this first. Keynes proposes in the general theory that there be a infrastructure agency that would keep all the needed and desired infrastructure projects cataloged, that would be public knowledge, and that as the economy went up and down, that they would speed up or slow down the rate at which you would implement those infrastructure projects. Now, it's pretty important to understand this is a very technical point. All through the 20s, when Keynes was trying in the Liberal Party summer schools, when the Liberal Party was trying to figure out a new way forward for itself, Keynes was pushing, this is long before the general theory, long before public works became a big issue. He was pushing for restructuring the British budget so that there was a current budget and a capital budget. And all of the infrastructure projects would be in the capital budget. And so in a technical sense, and he says this then again over and over again in the 30s and 40s, I don't believe in deficit spending. I believe in capital budget spending. So he would say, when the economy's going down, let's increase capital expenditure on infrastructure projects. When the economy's overheating, let's pull back on those projects. So I think in that sense, he would have liked there already to be an agency. All those shovel-ready projects would be on the shelf. They'd be public knowledge. You could go find them in a database somewhere. You'd have something equivalent to the Federal Reserve. People would say, okay, bridges are falling apart in Arizona. Let's fix those bridges. Airports aren't big enough in North Carolina. Let's increase the size of those airports. So I don't think he would be against this, but he would want it to be done on a different budgetary basis than we did it. And you know, he believed, for instance, that those projects all had to have a rate of return tagged on them. And so you would know when the rate of return, that the projects you picked out weren't the politically optimal projects, but the ones that had the highest rate of return. So I think he wouldn't have been against a huge infrastructure project to help relieve the economy, but he would have proposed it on pretty different terms than it was actually done.
So you have to ask the question, which Hayek, when you ask questions like this, because he actually had very different views over the course of his life in terms of monetary theory and policy. Certainly, one of the views that I think many economists have today is that when you have a massive crisis, that what you want to do is inject liquidity, but you don't want to keep injecting liquidity. So when I talk to monetary economists who are in the Hayekian mode, this would be people like George Selgin at the Cato Institute, or Larry White. They said, well, you know, maybe the initial injection was okay, but the quantitative easing that followed after that was not the right policy. Some people invoke Walter Bagehot, the person who wrote Lombard Street, used to be the editor of the Economist magazine back in the 1880s, said, well, the role of a central bank is to be a lender of last resort, but because you don't want banks that are illiquid to go under. If they're insolvent, yeah, but if they're illiquid, just because of the moment that everybody's trying to have a run on the bank, you want to provide liquidity, but do it at a high interest rate. Don't do it at low interest rate. Make it painful for the banks to keep the money that you're lending to them. These are some ideas that I think are pretty interesting. So, yeah, what would Hayek say about TARP? Good question. But there we have it.
We're going to stop. Yeah. I wish to thank Brad and Bruce for being with us, and please join me in doing that. And thank you all for attending.